My name is Kate White. I am a professor at the University of British Columbia. I'm in Marketing and Behavioural Science. My training is as a social psychologist, so I'm really interested in the psychology underlying people's behaviors, and I specifically study sustainable consumption behaviors. Two things that are relatively new. One is marketers and the fashion industry are just getting more and more sophisticated in terms of the data they have about consumers and their preferences. So this could mean just deep, market research about consumers and preferences, but more and more it also means data from online sources. So data analytics that's very detailed and very precise about, what geographic location someone's in, what demographic they are, what time of day they're more likely to click on something. And so they can get really, really sort of nuanced and tailoring and targeting to people. Really understanding your psychology, and maybe not even your psychology, just your behavior and what you're most likely to do under certain circumstances. So I think that's a big piece in online contexts. This idea that they've always been encouraging us, reminding us, and reinforcing us to buy. Now they're just even better at it. They can be even more tailored and even more targeted. The second thing that I think is really interesting in with regards to fashion is how the fashion industry encourages something that marketers call planned obsolescence. And planned obsolescence is this idea that sometimes products are specifically designed and manufactured and marketed to be used for a very short time. So the idea is you just use the product for a short time, you discard it, and then you're going to buy something else. So it keeps consumers buying stuff. And with fashion, it's interesting because there's two kind of sides to this. So the kind of more common way this gets discussed is physical obsolescence, which means there's something in the way the product is being created where it's meant to break down at a certain time. And you can think about like light bulbs do this, but with fashion, it could just be the way the materials are created or the way things are constructed, that they are meant to break down fairly quickly. And a common example is just things like pantyhose or nylons. Like typically they're going to last you one or two wears and then you have to buy another one. The other one that's really interesting is psychological obsolescence, which is it's not that the product itself isn't functional anymore, right? The jacket is fine. The pair of shoes is still perfectly durable. You can still wear those shoes, but it's something psychological that's happening. So by continually promoting these ever-changing trends based on style, the fashion industry is encouraging us to discard things and go for the newer option. And so I think there's lots of things marketers are doing. Part of it is they have these detailed analytics and they can keep pushing us things when we're on the internet, on social media, showing us, social influencers unboxing these things and wearing and promoting these things. All these things are promoting this idea that we need something new. And so I think that's something that's really interesting, psychologically speaking, that's happening within the fashion industry. Yeah, so sometimes it gets called the attitude behavior gap or the intention action gap, and it kind of means the same thing. And so the idea is that on average, most consumers have fairly positive attitudes and their intentions to act around sustainability are positive. They would like to be more sustainable, but when people actually end up doing the behavior and they actually click and make that purchase, or they're in the store and they make that purchase, they don't always make that sustainable choice that they were intending to. Part of this is just how our brains work as human beings. And there's some different models of decision making that suggest that there's sort of these two dual processes that we use when we're thinking and we're making decisions. One of them sometimes gets called system one, which is if you're making a decision and you're being very sort of automatic and quick and effortless in your decision making. And you can imagine, certain things we do, we don't really think much about it. We just grab that item in the grocery store and without really thinking about it. And that's system one. System two is when we're being more careful and deliberative and deeper in our thinking. And the truth is we all use both styles of decision making. The other truth is that we're in system one a lot of the time because it would be overwhelming to be weighing all the pros and cons and comparing all the alternatives. For every single decision we make each day, we just can't be in system two all the time. And so part of the issue with the intention action gap is that when we're setting our intentions, we're usually in system 2. We're thinking really carefully. We just read an article about the fashion industry and oh, I'm going to change my behavior, and you set these intentions. But a lot of these things we're doing on a day-to-day basis are actually in system 1, right? So we're going to be influenced by other things than our intentions to be sustainable. Price or accessibility, or it looks cool. Maybe that's influencing rather than my intentions. The best solution is if the system were set up better. So if the system were set up so that it were easy, seamless, rewarding to make the more sustainable choice, and it was just easier for us to do, we would be making these more sustainable choices. So sometimes behavioral scientists talk about choice architecture. So just setting up the system and the way things are presenting in a way that kind of steers us towards, more equitable and sustainable options. If you as a consumer were sort of like, okay, well, how could I set up this for myself? I think you could sort of take a behavioral science lens and kind of think about, okay, well, how can I kind of analyze my own behavior and kind of figure out what might work for me? And so I would probably take an approach where you do a little bit of observation of your own behaviors and what's influencing you. So, why did I buy that item that the next day I'm like, why did I do that? And what was it that drove that action? One of the things that tends to drive both unsustainable and sustainable behaviors is what other people are doing. So social influence. So for example, if I'm seeing a lot of my friends or social media influencers that are buying a certain type of product or engaging in a certain type of behavior, I'm more likely to follow suit. So if I know that, okay, every time I buy something that I regret a week later and wonder why I did it because it wasn't sustainable, it's because I saw someone else doing it, and recognizing that and figuring out, well, what could I do to almost habit hack myself? I think the solution isn't to stop being with your friends, and it's not to stop necessarily doing some of the things that you're doing, but you could think about how could you use social influence for good. So maybe you do create some goals for yourself and you tell other people, right? And you tell your friends and you tell your support network. So if you wanted to do a buy nothing or a buy sustainable, you set yourself a goal for 6 months, and then you tell your friends and family and you publicly announce it on your Facebook or your Instagram. That would be a way to sort of turn that psychological idea of social influence on its head and sort of use it for good. Another one we talk about is habit formation. So really thinking about how to break a habit that you have that you think is negative, and then replacing it with more positive habits. And so one of the things to think about with habit formation is, are there certain triggers that sort of set off the habit? So one of the things about habits is there are these behaviors that kind of happen automatically, but they get triggered by something in the environment, and that's what sort of sets them in motion. So if every time you get an email from this brand, you always click on it and you always buy something and you always regret it, that's a trigger for you. If that is a problem for you, the emails, it's a sale and that's my trigger. Go in and unsubscribe from those emails, right? That's a way of setting up the choice architecture. Doesn't mean you can't go to that website and buy something if you really need it, but it means you basically are controlling the way these options are getting presented to you. Yeah, I think one thing is communicating about things like, where is the item sourced and how is it manufactured, how is it distributed, like providing that information. I think some consumers are actually jaded by greenwashing, right? They've seen it before and then it comes out that it wasn't as good as they thought, or so I think transparency is important. So one is asking companies to really fully map out what's going on in your supply chain and what's going on in the full life cycle of the product. Map out where is energy being used, water, carbon footprint, is ethical and fair labor practices being used, all those things, mapping those out. And then some kind of reporting and disclosure on this. So this could be, maybe there's some kind of body that you report certain metrics back to, some kind of governing body. This could be maybe you're required to put a report on your webpage. This could be when you're presenting things online to customers. Maybe there's a little way of reporting how much water was used. What's the carbon footprint of this item? Just kind of like how in some industries, like calorie counts now are being reported. And then the last one is just on what fashion brands or companies, what can they communicate in regulating that a little bit? So what is deceptive? Maybe there's a trade-off with a product. So maybe it's really sustainable on one thing, but really unsustainable on another attribute, right? So is that deceptive advertising if I'm only talking about half of the story, right? So I think those are three things that will kind of help make this more of the default, right? Where companies and brands would be held accountable for what they're doing and what they're communicating to consumers.